A packed corporate boardroom in Chicago. High ceilings, cold glass. Executives sit in a heavy, suffocating silence. Tension fills the air like a coming storm. A major technical failure has just cost the company millions. One man stands alone at the center of the room. Daniel Hayes, 42, a single dad. The accusation from the vice president is sharp and final. "This was your responsibility, Daniel." He doesn't argue. He doesn't defend himself to save his job. He simply says quietly, "I understand." Minutes later, he's fired. He turns to leave. And that's when the CEO finally speaks. The secret is out. Destiny finally begun today. Daniel Hayes was a man who understood the architecture of a heavy life. At 42, his presence was measured not by the volume of his voice, but by the profound, steady silence he maintained. A shadow moving through the salt-crusted, wind-whipped canyons of downtown Chicago. To the thousands of high-powered tech executives and ambitious brokers who rushed past him every day, he was simply the operations lead, an invisible gear in the city's vast, uncaring machine. He wore simple, well-pressed shirts and carried a leather bag that had seen better days, its corners scuffed by years of commuting. But behind his tired, slate-gray eyes was the mind of a master, a man who once spoke the language of complex systems and global logistics with the ease of a veteran commander. Daniel was a widower, a title he wore with a stoic, heartbreaking dignity that few in the frantic corporate world could truly comprehend. 5 years ago, his wife Elena had passed away, the victim of a sudden, aggressive illness that had reordered Daniel's entire universe into a colder, quieter place. In the hollow, deafening silence after the funeral, Daniel realized that the 80-hour work weeks and the high-stakes pressure of his previous executive role were a betrayal of the only thing he had left: his son, Noah. Noah was now 10, a bright, observant boy who had inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's curious, sparkling eyes. To ensure he was home for every school play, every soccer game, and every late-night math problem, Daniel had made a tactical retreat. He stepped down from the golden circle of executive leadership. He had taken a mid-level operations role at Kane Dynamics, a global infrastructure firm. He traded the pursuit of power for the pursuit of presence. He lived a life of absolute rugged discipline: 5 a.m. black coffee, 6 a.m. school lunches with the crust cut off, and a commitment to being the first face Noah saw when the school bus dropped him off at the corner. He didn't chase promotions or engage in the toxic hustle culture of the office. He did his work with a surgical precision, avoided the political crossfire of the break room, and never once took credit for a project that wasn't solely his own. The workplace at Kane Dynamics was a shark tank, a place where ego was the primary currency and status was weaponized like a rapier. Most of Daniel's colleagues were young, hungry, and perpetually looking for a ladder to climb or a throat to step on. They noticed Daniel, but they overlooked him. They saw his lack of ambition as a lack of talent. They saw his refusal to play the political game as a sign of weakness. Only a few of the older technicians respected him, knowing that when the systems groaned under the weight of a global peak, Daniel Hayes was the only one who didn't panic. He was the anchor in their storm, the man who stayed until the last server breathed correctly, even if no one ever thanked him for it. Daniel's philosophy was simple: fix what is broken, protect what is whole. He viewed the city's digital infrastructure not as cold wires in silicon, but as a lifeline for millions. He understood that a single misplaced line of code could shut down a hospital or freeze an emergency response grid. He felt the weight of that responsibility every single day. He spent his lunches reading technical manuals or studying new encryption protocols, always preparing for a disaster he hoped would never come. He didn't need a plaque on the wall or a mention in the newsletter to know his worth. His worth was sitting at his kitchen table every evening, helping Noah build Lego spaceships or explaining the physics of a bridge. The current project was the most critical of the decade, a high-stakes migration of the city's emergency response network, a multi-million-dollar contract that involved 5 different departments. It was the kind of project where a single misplaced decimal point could result in a catastrophe for the entire region. Daniel had been the silent hand guiding the operational side, ensuring the hardware could handle the new digital load. He had warned the software leads, men with expensive degrees and louder voices, that their encryption protocols were too heavy for the current servers. He had pointed out the bottleneck in the secondary cooling loop, but his warnings were dismissed as old-school caution in fear of innovation by Marcus Sterling, the senior VP who valued speed over safety. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't send frantic, "I told you so" emails. He simply did his part of the job to the highest possible standard and went home to make spaghetti with Noah. He believed that if he kept his head down and his work honest, the truth would hold the structure together. He didn't realize that in a building made of glass, the people at the top are always looking for someone at the bottom to take the fall when the first crack appears. He didn't realize that in the corporate world, loyalty is often a one-way street that leads directly to a dead end. He walked into the tower on Monday morning, unaware that the quiet life he had fought so hard to build was about to be dismantled by the very people he was trying to protect. He looked at a photo of Sarah on his desk, whispered a silent promise to keep things steady, and prepared for the final phase of the migration. The collapse happened at 3:14 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday morning. A massive system failure during the final phase of the migration caused a total blackout of the emergency response grid. Data was lost, financial penalties were triggered instantly, and for 45 terrifying minutes, the city's safety was left in a digital vacuum. The Aura network, the crown jewel of Kane Dynamics, had flatlined. By 8 a.m., the headquarters of Kane Dynamics was a pressure cooker of high-decibel panic. Executives were screaming into phones, and the board of directors was demanding a head on a silver platter before the stock market opened. They needed accountability, and they needed it before the news cycle could tear the company's reputation to shreds. The real cause was clear to anyone who knew the architecture. A junior software lead in the development department, desperate to hit a bonus-triggered deadline, had pushed an untested patch to bypass a security lag. This move had been authorized by Marcus Sterling, who viewed technical limitations as obstacles to his commission. It was a failure of oversight and greed. But as the internal investigation began, the paper trail became conveniently blurred. Marcus knew his career was on the line. He needed a scapegoat who wouldn't fight back, someone with enough access to be plausible, but not enough political power to defend themselves. The logs showed that the last person to physically touch the master server rack on the 42nd floor was Daniel Hayes. He had been there at midnight, performing a final thermal check to ensure the rack didn't overheat during the transition. The boardroom meeting at 10 a.m. was a masterclass in corporate execution. The senior VP, Marcus, wore a watch that cost more than Daniel's car and a suit that smelled of expensive cologne in desperation. He led the charge. He pointed a manicured finger at Daniel, his voice echoing with a fake, performative outrage designed to distract from his own involvement. The migration failed because the hardware couldn't sustain the transition. Daniel, you were the lead on physical operations. You signed off on the rack integrity. This failure has cost us $4 million in penalties and potentially ruined our reputation. This was your responsibility and yours alone. Your incompetence has endangered the city. Daniel stood at the center of the long mahogany table, surrounded by the most powerful people in the company. He looked at Marcus, and he saw the fear behind the man's aggression. He saw the junior developers sitting in the back of the room, their faces pale and eyes downcast, knowing that if the truth came out, their careers were over before they had even begun. They were young parents, first-time homeowners, people with everything to lose. Daniel realized in a heartbeat that if he defended himself, if he pulled out the hard copies of the emails and the diagnostic reports, proving he had warned them, the resulting investigation would trigger a wave of firings that would destroy a dozen families. He thought of Noah. He thought of the lesson he taught his son every night, that integrity isn't about being right. It's about being the person who can handle the weight of the moment. He knew that the system needed a scapegoat to stop the bleeding and prevent a total corporate meltdown. He also knew that he was the only one in the room strong enough to survive the fall. He chose to protect the people who were too weak to protect themselves, even the ones who were currently throwing him under the bus. He chose to be the anchor one last time. "I was the last person in the server room," Daniel said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through Marcus's shouting like a cold wind. He didn't blink. He didn't lower his gaze. He looked at the empty seat at the head of the table, the seat belonging to the CEO, Victoria Kane, who was currently watching the meeting via a silent video link from her private office. I signed off on the rack integrity. If there was a failure in the hardware's response to the load, it was my responsibility. I accept the consequences. The silence that followed was heavy with shock. Marcus and the other executives shared a look of predatory relief. They had expected a fight. They had prepared a mountain of fabricated evidence to bury him, but Daniel had handed them the win without a single struggle. Some in the room knew the truth. They knew Daniel was covering for their incompetence. But no one spoke. No one stood up for the man who was currently saving them. In the world of Kane Dynamics, silence wasn't just golden, it was a survival tactic. Daniel Hayes stood there, a titan of character in a room full of ghosts, accepting a defeat he didn't earn because he understood that the weight of a lie is lighter than the weight of a ruined life. He felt a strange sense of peace as the accusations continued. He was no longer part of their game. He had stepped out of the machine. He looked at Marcus one last time, seeing not a victor, but a small, terrified man who would have to live with the truth. Daniel realized that while they were taking his job, they couldn't take his dignity. He was a father first, and today he had shown his son what a real man looks like, even if Noah would never know the details. The boardroom doors felt like the exit to a prison he had been living in for years. He walked out, his head held high, leaving the echoes of the Iron Queen behind him. The machinery of human resources moved with a terrifying, clinical speed. Within 10 minutes of his admission, the director of HR stepped into the boardroom with a pre-printed termination agreement. There was no appeal process. There was no investigation into mitigating circumstances. The company needed a clean break and a clear narrative for the investors. Daniel Hayes was fired for gross negligence, resulting in catastrophic financial loss and public risk. His keycard was deactivated before he even left the room. He sat in the small glass-walled HR office while they revoked his server access and erased his corporate identity. The sounds of the office continued around him. The phones ringing, the keyboards clicking, the muffled laughter of people who were glad it wasn't them, as if he were already a ghost. He didn't feel anger. He felt a strange, hollow sense of relief. He had held the line. He had protected the junior staff. He gathered his few personal belongings from his desk, a photo of Noah at his last soccer game, a small wooden clock Elena had given him for their 10th anniversary, and his favorite fountain pen. As he walked toward the elevators, he felt the weight of the judgmental stares from his former colleagues. Some whispered as he passed, their voices sounding like dry leaves in the wind. Others looked away, unable to meet the eyes of the man they had just betrayed with their silence. He was the failure of the 42nd floor, a cautionary tale for the next generation of climbers. He stepped into the elevator, the silver doors closing on his career like the lid of a coffin. The descent felt endless, a vertical drop into an uncertain future. Outside, the Chicago air was biting and gray, smelling of rain and industrial exhaust. Daniel walked to a small, lonely park bench a few blocks away from the tower, near the edge of the lake. He sat down, his box of belongings resting on his knees, and watched the city move around him. He felt the cold reality of his situation settling in like a deep frost. He was 42, a single father, and he had just been fired from a high-level role for negligence. Finding another job in this industry, with that mark on his record, would be nearly impossible. The financial stability he had worked so hard to build for Noah, the college fund, the mortgage, the security, was gone in a single morning. He pulled out his phone. He had a notification, a message from Noah. "What time will you be home, Dad? I finished my science project on solar energy. I want to show you before dinner. Love you." Daniel stared at the screen, his vision blurring for a brief, unshielded second. The calm he was famous for was starting to crack under the immense pressure of his failure as a provider. How could he tell a 10-year-old that they might have to move? How could he explain that doing the right thing had cost them their future? He realized that while he had saved the jobs of his colleagues, he had potentially sacrificed the safety of his son. He felt the crushing weight of the double bind, the choice between being a man of integrity and being a man who provides. He didn't reply to the text. He couldn't find the words that wouldn't sound like a goodbye. He sat in the silence of the park for 2 hours, watching the waves of Lake Michigan crash against the concrete. He thought about the boardroom, about Marcus's smug face, and about the CEO, Victoria Kane, who had remained a silent shadow during the entire execution. He assumed she was just like the rest of them, measuring her value in the stock price and the speed of the firing. He thought about Sarah and whether she would be proud of him or terrified for their son. He felt a deep, cynical bitterness starting to take root in his heart, a feeling that in this world, there was no room for a man who didn't fight for himself. He looked at his calloused hands and wondered if the grease and the labor had been for nothing. But Daniel Hayes didn't know that while he was sitting on that bench, the silence in the boardroom was being broken by a voice that carried the weight of $1 billion. Victoria Kane was not a woman who missed the details. At 38, she had built her empire on the ability to see the signal in the noise, the small, irregular data point that revealed a larger, often dangerous truth. She had been silent during the boardroom meeting, her video feed blacked out to the participants, but her eyes had never left the screen. She had watched Marcus Sterling's sweating upper lip. She had watched the junior developers looking at their shoes with the guilt of the condemned. And most importantly, she had watched Daniel Hayes. She didn't believe in coincidences, and she didn't believe in sudden, uncharacteristic incompetence from a man with a flawless record. She knew Daniel's file better than Marcus did. She had personally authorized his hire 3 years ago because she valued stability over flash. She had seen him in the hallways at 6 p.m., always leaving exactly on time. And she had admired the quiet, unshakable focus he brought to his work. As soon as the elevator doors closed on Daniel, Victoria walked into the boardroom. The room went silent instantly, the temperature seeming to drop 10 degrees as the Iron Queen took her seat at the head of the table. "Marcus," she said, her voice a calm, dangerous whisper that made the pens on the table rattle. "Pull up the internal server logs from midnight to 2 a.m. Now, not the summaries. The raw metadata. I want the keystroke entry logs and the remote access IDs." Marcus fumbled with the remote, his hands shaking. "Victoria, it's unnecessary." Daniel admitted to the hardware failure. "We've already handled the transition. The PR team is drafting the statement." "I didn't ask for your opinion on the transition, Marcus. I asked for the logs. Do it now, or I'll have the IT security lead do it for you while you clean out your desk." The logs appeared on the massive screen. Victoria pointed to a series of subroutine entries. "These are code injections from the development department at 1:45 a.m. They were pushed remotely using an override key that belongs to your office, Marcus." Daniel Hayes was in the server room, yes, but the thermal sensors show he was checking the cooling fans. He didn't touch a keyboard. He didn't touch a terminal. The failure was a direct result of an untested patch push that you authorized to meet the deadline. She looked around the room, her gaze piercing the souls of every executive present. "Daniel Hayes didn't cause this failure. He stood there and took the fall for it, so I wouldn't fire every single one of you for your utter lack of oversight, your greed, and your cowardice. He saw a dozen people about to lose their livelihoods because of your mistake, and he chose to be the only man in this room with enough spine to handle the weight." She stood up, her posture a mountain of authority. "You just fired the only man in this building with enough character to lead it. And you did it because it was easy. You chose a lie to save your bonuses, while he chose a truth to save your families. If doing the right thing costs you everything, type, I still do it." Victoria realized that Daniel Hayes was the most valuable asset she had, and she had just allowed her subordinates to throw him away like trash. She saw a hero in him, not for the work he did, but for the man he was. He had reminded her of a version of herself she had almost forgotten, the version that cared about more than just the bottom line. She knew right then that she had to bring him back, not just to fix the system, but to fix the very culture of her company. She realized that she had been so focused on the summit that she had forgotten to check the quality of the people building the mountain. She called her private secretary. "Find Daniel Hayes, now, and tell the driver to pick him up in the executive sedan. I don't care where he is. Daniel was still sitting on the park bench, the box of his life resting on the wood beside him, when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. It was Victoria Kane's private office. 10 minutes later, a black executive sedan pulled up to the curb. Daniel was confused, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and confusion as he was ushered back into the glass tower. This time, the lobby was different. The whispers were gone. The security guards stood at attention as he passed. The atmosphere had shifted from a funeral to a coronation. He was led back to the boardroom. The executives were still there, but they weren't sitting. They were standing against the wall, their heads bowed in a shame so thick it was almost physical. Victoria stood at the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. She turned as Daniel entered, her expression soft and genuine. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice clear and echoing, "I've reviewed the logs. I've seen the thermal data. I know you didn't touch that software, and I know exactly why you said you did." She looked at the line of executives. "Marcus Sterling has been relieved of his duties, effective immediately, as has anyone else who remained silent while an innocent man was attacked. Their offices are currently being cleared." She walked over to Daniel and offered her hand. It was a firm, honest grip. "I'm not just offering you your job back, Daniel. I'm offering you the position of Chief Operations Officer. I need someone who values integrity more than a paycheck. I need a leader who knows what it means to protect their team even when it costs them everything. I need the man who was the last one in the server room, but the only one with his eyes open." Daniel stood quietly. He didn't feel a sense of triumph. He didn't seek revenge against the men who had betrayed him. He only thought of Noah and the science project waiting at home. He thought of Sarah, and he felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. "Can I still be home for my son by 5, Victoria? That's the only condition I have. I won't trade his childhood for a title, no matter how grand." Victoria smiled, the first real, unscripted smile anyone in that building had seen in years. "Daniel, your son is going to be proud of the man you are, and you'll be home for every dinner from now on. That is the first line of your new contract. In fact, we're building a new child care and education center in the East Wing. I want your input on it. We're going to build a company that Noah would be proud to work for one day." Final scene. An hour later, Daniel returned home. The sun was setting over the city, casting long golden shadows across his modest apartment. Noah opened the door and ran to him, nearly knocking him over. Daniel kneels down and hugs him tight, the scent of the boy's hair grounding him in the reality of what truly mattered. "Everything's okay, Noah," Daniel whispered. "I fixed the project. Let's go see your science experiment. I want to hear everything about solar energy, every single detail." Noah smiled, his eyes bright with the absolute trust of a child who knows his father is a hero. As they sat at the kitchen table, the light of the city began to glow outside their window. Daniel Hayes had reclaimed his future without losing his soul. He had proven that the strongest structures aren't made of steel. They are built on the integrity of a single man who refuses to look away. He stood there and took the fall for something he didn't do. Not because he was weak, but because he understood what mattered more. He chose character over status and his son over his ego. And sometimes, doing the right thing is the only way for the truth to finally find its way home. Daniel Hayes proved that the greatest engines in the world are fueled by kindness, and the strongest hands are the ones that reach out to help. True power is staying silent when the world demands a lie and letting the truth speak for itself. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Chip Healing Stories and tell me, would you have spoken or stayed silent?